Sign that, and you'll walk into a trap, the black girl said. The billionaire's smile vanished. The pen weighed almost nothing. Solid silver, hand-engraved, worth more than most people earned in a month. Malcolm Hale held it between his fingers the way a surgeon holds a scalpel, steady, precise, already committed to the cut. 86 floors above downtown Chicago, inside a glass-walled boardroom that overlooked half the city, the most powerful merger in American infrastructure history was about to become official. $300 million. 14 months of negotiation. 2 legal teams. 1 signature line. Every chair around the 40-foot walnut conference table was occupied. Attorneys in tailored suits whispered final confirmations to each other. Board members reviewed their phones one last time before the cameras would begin rolling downstairs. 3 investors from New York had flown in that morning specifically to witness this moment. The air inside the room smelled like fresh coffee and expensive cologne and the quiet tension that always accompanies large amounts of money about to change hands. Malcolm smiled. It was the smile of a man who had spent 30 years climbing from a one-room engineering office on the south side of Chicago to the top of one of the largest infrastructure firms in the country. $4.7 billion in personal net worth. 12,000 employees across 9 states. His name on buildings, bridges, and highway systems from Illinois to Virginia. This merger was supposed to be his crowning achievement. The moment that turned a company into a legacy. And then a voice came from the doorway. Sign that, and you'll walk into a trap. It was not loud. It carried no aggression, no panic, no theatrical flair. It was the voice of a child. A girl, no older than 8. She stood just inside the threshold, her dark skin catching the pale afternoon light that poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind her. Her hair was braided close to her scalp in neat rows, and a thin blue bracelet, faded almost to white from years of wear, circled her left wrist. She wore an oversized gray sweater that hung past her knees, and sneakers that had clearly been walked in too many times. Against the backdrop of the glass and chrome boardroom, she looked like a photograph from a different century placed inside a frame it was never meant to fit. Every conversation in the room stopped. Every breath paused. 14 executives, 6 attorneys, 3 board members, and a man worth $4.7 billion all turned toward a child who looked like she had wandered in from a completely different world. Malcolm's smile did not disappear right away. It lingered, the way a candle holds its flame for a second after the wind arrives. Then it was gone. Excuse me, he said. The girl did not blink. She did not shift her weight. She did not look at anyone else in the room. Her eyes were fixed on the stack of documents beneath his hand, as though the pages themselves had told her something that nobody else could hear. Across the table, Judith Ashford, the firm's lead counsel, exhaled through a polished smile. She was 53 years old, elegant, razor-sharp, with auburn hair pinned behind her ears and a reputation for never losing composure. Security must have let someone onto the wrong floor. Her voice was warm, controlled, professional. The kind of voice that made juries relax and made opponents hesitate. She turned toward the nearest assistant. Could you please? I'm not lost, the girl said quietly. The assistant froze mid-step. Judith's smile dimmed by half a degree. Malcolm set the pen down slowly, carefully, as if placing a loaded weapon on a table he no longer trusted. What's your name? He asked. Sarah. Sarah Ellington. And how did you get up here, Sarah? She paused. Not because she didn't know the answer. Because she was deciding how much of the answer to give. Someone left the door open, she said. But that's not why I'm here. A few people chuckled nervously. One board member leaned toward another and whispered something behind his palm. The whisper sounded like amusement, but the hand that covered it trembled slightly. Nobody was sure whether to laugh or be concerned, so most chose something in between, a polite discomfort that sat on their faces like a mask that didn't. Keep the feet. But Malcolm did not laugh. He studied her the way he studied balance sheets, carefully, patiently, looking for the number that didn't belong. You said I'd walk into a trap, he repeated. Sarah nodded once. What kind of trap? The kind you don't see until it's already closed. Judith leaned forward slightly. The movement was precise, measured, the way a chess player advances a pawn. Reale, we're already 40 minutes behind schedule. The press team is downstairs setting up. Investors are watching remotely from 3 different time zones. We cannot allow a child's imagination to disrupt 14 months of. I'm not asking you, Malcolm said, without raising his voice. The sentence landed like a closed door. 5 words, spoken softly, and yet every person in the room felt them in their chest. Judith pressed her lips together and said nothing more. Her fingers, however, moved silently to the edge of her leather portfolio and stayed there. Malcolm looked back at Sarah. Tell me what you mean. Sarah lifted her chin slightly. There was no defiance in the gesture. Only certainty. The kind of certainty that has nothing to do with age and everything to do with knowing something that matters. Page 51, she said. Read it again. Slowly. Nobody laughed this time. Page 51. Not the signature page. Not the executive summary. Not even the financial projections that most people flip to first. A specific page, deep inside a 214-page legal document that most people in the room had never read in full. The precision of the reference silenced every remaining skeptic. Because children guess in round numbers. They say page 10, page 20, the last page. They don't say page 51. Not unless they've seen something on page 51. Malcolm pulled the contract closer. The pages whispered against each other as he turned them, the only sound in a room that suddenly felt twice as large and half as safe. 47. 48. 49. 50. 51. He says scan the text. Legal definitions. Transfer provisions. Liability allocations. Indemnification clauses. At first glance, the language looked identical to every other section he had reviewed over the past 14 months. Dense, dry, deliberately boring, the kind of writing designed to make readers stop reading. Then he found it. A single paragraph near the bottom of the page. 14 lines of text buried beneath a subsection header so dull that no reasonable person would ever pause to examine it. But hidden inside those 14 lines was a cross-reference. A number. A redirect to a supplementary clause on page 54 that Malcolm had never seen before in any previous draft. His jaw tightened. He turned to page 54 without speaking. The room held its breath. City people in a glass box, suspended above a city of 3 million, and not one of them made a sound. When he found the reference clause, the color in his face shifted. Not dramatically. Not enough for most people to notice. But Sarah noticed. She had been watching his eyes, not his mouth. And across the table, Judith Ashford noticed too. Because Judith's fingers had just curled around the edge of her leather portfolio, and her knuckles had turned white. Malcolm read the clause twice. Then a third time. His voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. This would transfer operational governance. Daniel Akefer, head of internal compliance, immediately reached for his own copy. He was a tall man, deliberate in his movements, with gold-rimmed glasses and the kind of patience that made him exceptional at finding things other people missed. Pages rustled across the table like dry leaves in a sudden wind as other attorneys followed his lead. Daniel found the section and read it silently. His expression changed within seconds. This language was not in the version the board approved, he said. It was added during final formatting, Judith replied quickly. Too quickly. Standard practice during document finalization. No, Daniel said, removing his glasses and looking directly at her. It wasn't. The room split in half. Some faces showed confusion. Others showed alarm. A few showed something worse, recognition. As if they had suspected something was wrong for weeks but had chosen not to look because looking would have meant admitting that the celebration they were planning might be built on something hollow. Malcolm stood. At 6'4", with silver gray hair and a navy suit that fit like it had been stitched onto his body, he commanded every room he entered simply by existing in it. But he was not standing to command. It was standing because his legs needed to move before his mind could process what he had just read. He walked toward the windows. Below him, Chicago stretched in every direction. Highways, rivers, bridges, towers. A city built on steel and ambition and the kind of deals that happened in rooms exactly like this one. Traffic moved through the streets far below like blood through veins, carrying the pulse of a city that never stopped. Malcolm had spent 30 years building his company from a single engineering firm into a national empire. He had survived recessions, hostile takeovers, political investigations, and personal tragedies that would have broken weaker men. He had never, not once, in 3 decades, been blindsided inside his own boardroom. Until now. He turned around slowly. Nobody leaves this room. The sentence carried no anger. No urgency. No threat. Just weight. The weight of a man who understood that the next hour would determine whether 30 years of work meant something or meant nothing at all. Judith straightened in her chair. Malcolm, I strongly recommend we complete the signing and address any concerns afterward. Delaying now sends the wrong signal to investors and could cost the company. The signing is postponed. 3 words. Spoken the way a judge speaks a verdict. Judith closed her mouth. For a fraction of a second, something moved behind her eyes. Fear, or calculation. Malcolm couldn't tell which. Both looked the same from across a conference table. He looked at Daniel. Pull every version of this contract from the archive. Every draft, every revision log, every access record going back to the first day of negotiations. Daniel nodded and opened his laptop. His fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. Malcolm turned back toward Zara. The girl had not moved from the doorway. She stood there like a stone in a river, still and unmoved while everything around her flowed and churned. The storm clouds beyond the glass had thickened, and the afternoon light was beginning to dim. How did you know about page 51? He asked. Sarah touched the bracelet on her wrist. It was an unconscious gesture, the kind of thing a person does when they are reaching for courage they borrowed from someone else. I saw someone reading the contract last night. Here, in this building. They kept going back to that page. Over and over. Who? I don't know his name. Though. Dark coat. Silver things on his wrists. She meant cufflinks. And the other person? Sarah looked across the table. Not at anyone specific. But Judith Ashford shifted in her chair, and that small movement, barely an inch, told Malcolm everything her words had not. Daniel's laptop chimed. A notification appeared on the screen. He read it, and the color drained from his face like water leaving a cracked glass. Malcolm, the archive just flagged an unauthorized revision. When? Last night. 11:14 p.m. Someone accessed the final version and made changes to sections 47 through 55. From which account? Daniel hesitated. The hesitation lasted less than a second, but in this room, in this moment, it was enough to make everyone lean forward. Legal administration. Avery had turned toward Judith. She did not flinch. Her posture remained perfect. Her expression remained composed. But something behind her eyes had changed. A door had closed somewhere inside her, and everyone in the room could feel it. I review documents at all hours, she said. That is not unusual for counsel overseeing a transaction of this magnitude. Reviewing is not the same as revising, Daniel said. The system logs revisions automatically. If a clause was updated, it was part of scheduled formatting adjustments. Then what, Daniel said slowly, is the approval signature missing? The question hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Judith did not answer it. She reached for her water glass instead, and the slight tremor in her hand was visible to everyone within 5 feet. The glass touched her lips, but Malcolm noticed she did not actually drink. Sarah reached into her sweater pocket and pulled out an old phone. The screen was cracked from corner to corner. The case was scratched and peeling. It looked like a phone that had been dropped 100 times and picked up 101. She tapped it twice, and a photograph appeared. "I took this last night," she said, "when I was trying to find the elevator." Danielle took the phone carefully and connected it to the display screen mounted on the far wall. The image filled the monitor. A hallway. Marble floors gleaming under fluorescent lights. Glass office doors stretching into shadow. And standing beside a conference side table covered with spread-out contract pages, Judith Ashford, speaking intently with a man in a dark overcoat. The timestamp in the corner of the photograph read 11:21 p.m. Malcolm stared at the image. "Who is that man?" Nobody answered. The silence was so thick it felt like a wall. Daniel zoomed in. The face was partially turned away from the camera, but the frame, the posture, the expensive cut of the overcoat, and the silver cufflinks catching the hallway light were distinctive enough. One board member inhaled sharply. Another pushed back from the table as if distance could protect him from what he was seeing. "That's Victor Strand," someone whispered. Victor Strand. The outside merger consultant hired 7 months earlier to facilitate the transaction. A man who held no voting power inside Hale Infrastructure, no equity, no formal authority. But a man with intimate knowledge of every clause, every valuation, every vulnerability in the deal. A man who knew where every door was, and which ones were unlocked. Malcolm's voice dropped to a register that made the air in the room feel heavier. "Victor Strand was in this building last night. With you. After hours. Standing beside a contract that was altered without authorization." Judith stood. The movement was sudden, almost defiant. "You are making an accusation without sufficient evidence." "I'm describing a photograph. A photograph taken by a child who had no authorization to be in this building." Malcolm looked at Sarah. Then back at Judith. "And yet. She was. And everything she's said so far has been true." The room became so quiet that the rain, which had begun falling softly against the windows, sounded like a standing ovation. Danielle pulled another file from the archive. A backup copy of the original contract, automatically saved by the system before the unauthorized changes were applied. He opened both versions side by side on the screen. The differences were devastating. In the approved version, governance authority remained with the existing board for 24 months following the merger. Standard protective language designed to ensure continuity and stability during transition. In the altered version, a hidden provision allowed an external management committee to assume full operational control within 90 days of signing. The committee's membership was not defined anywhere in the contract itself. It was referenced in a separate document, a document filed under a supplementary appendix code that had never been shared with the board, never presented during review meetings, never discussed in any session that Daniel could find in the records. "This would have handed the company to people outside this room," Daniel said quietly. Within 3 months of Malcolm signing that page, Malcolm stood motionless. 7 years. Tens of thousands of employees. Billions in contracts. Communities rebuilt, highways constructed, bridges engineered across rivers that had divided neighborhoods for decades. And one signature, one stroke of a silver pen, would have given it all away. He turned toward the conference table and placed both hands flat on the polished surface. His knuckles were white. His breathing was controlled. His face betrayed nothing. "I want Victor Strand in this room within the hour." Before anyone could respond, the conference room door opened. A man walked in carrying a slim leather briefcase and wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Zara's entire apartment building. His smile was confident, practiced, perfected over 12 years of board meetings and shareholder dinners. The kind of smile that belonged on magazine covers and conference keynotes. Arthur Langley. Senior Board Director. 12 years of service. One of Malcolm's closest and most trusted advisors. Arthur stopped 3 steps inside the room. His smile lasted exactly 2 seconds before it collapsed under the weight of 14 silent stares. "What's going on?" he asked. Malcolm looked from Arthur to the display screen, where the hallway photograph still glowed against the wall. Then he looked at Zara. The girl's expression had not changed. But her eyes moved to Arthur, and something in her posture shifted. Not fair. Recognition. The quiet, certain kind that comes from having seen something you were not supposed to see. "Sit down, Arthur," Malcolm said. Arthur glanced around the room. His eyes moved from face to face, searching for an ally, a reassuring nod, any signal that the world he had walked into was still the one he expected. He found nothing. "Is there a problem with the signing?" "Sit down." Arthur sat. He placed his briefcase on the table with deliberate calm, but his left hand gripped the handle half a second too long. Daniel turned the laptop toward him. "Can you explain why your access credentials were used to approve a document transfer from the compliance archive at 10:47 last night?" Arthur's eyes narrowed. "I wasn't in the building last night. The system says otherwise." "Then the system is wrong." Sarah spoke softly from the doorway. "He was here." Avery turned toward her again. This child who kept appearing at the edges of revelations like a small, quiet witness the universe had placed in exactly the right position at exactly the right time. "I saw him," she said. "Before I saw her." She looked at Judith. "He came first. Then she arrived. Then they both went into the office at the end of the hall." Arthur's composure cracked. "Not entirely. But enough." A muscle twitched near his jaw. His breathing shifted from slow and measured to something quicker, shallowy. Malcolm noticed all of it. "Arthur," he said. "I'm going to ask you one question. And I need you to understand that the answer matters more than anything you've ever said to me in 12 years. Arthur met his gas. "Did you know the contract had been changed?" The silence lasted 4 full seconds. In a boardroom, 4 seconds of silence is an eternity. Entire careers can collapse in 4 seconds. Entire partnerships can dissolve. "I knew something had been changed," Arthur said finally. His voice sounded different now. Heavier. Older. "But I didn't know what." Judith closed her eyes. Malcolm did not move. "Explain." Arthur exhaled slowly, like a man setting down a weight he had been carrying up a staircase that never seemed to end. 3 weeks ago, Judith asked me to co-sign an amendment to the merger document. She told me it was a formatting correction. A technical adjustment to clause numbering. I trusted her. eBay co-signed hundreds of documents with her over the years. I approved it without reviewing the full text. Without reviewing it, Daniel repeated flatly. Arthur looked at him. "Would you have reviewed a formatting amendment from someone you trusted for a decade?" The question landed. Daniel said nothing. "And last night?" Malcolm asked. Arthur's voice grew quieter. "Last night, I came back because something didn't feel right. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the way Judith had asked me, the timing, the urgency. I pulled the access log. I saw the revision timestamps. I confronted her. I looked at Judith. She told me it was nothing." Judith kept her eyes closed. "But I saw Victor Strand leaving the parking garage while I was walking in," Arthur continued. 11:30 at night. Carrying a briefcase. And that's when I knew it wasn't nothing. The room absorbed his words in complete silence. The rain intensified outside, streaking the windows with silver lines that distorted the city lights below like a painting left in the rain. Malcolm turned toward Daniel. "The backup file. The original version. Is it fully intact?" "Completely intact. The system preserved it automatically before the changes were applied." "And the altered version, can you trace every change to a specific account?" Daniel nodded. Every single one. Malcolm looked at Judith. His voice carried no anger, no satisfaction, no vengeance. Only exhaustion disguised as control. The kind of tiredness that doesn't come from lack of sleep but from discovering that someone you trusted had been working against you. You've worked with me for 9 years. Judith finally opened her eyes. They were dry, but something in them had fractured. 9 years, Judith. He gave you authority that most attorneys never receive in an entire career. He trusted you with the legal foundation of this company. The company has weaknesses you refuse to see, she said. Every company has weaknesses. Not like this. Her voice sharpened briefly, carrying the edge of conviction that had probably kept her going through months of deception. The pension liabilities, the regulatory exposure, the infrastructure debt. That is not your decision to make. Someone had to act. No. Malcolm's voice dropped to a tone so quiet it felt louder than shouting. Someone wanted to. That's different. And that difference is the only thing that separates leadership from betrayal. The distinction silenced the room like a bell that had stopped ringing but whose vibration still hung in the air. Daniel's laptop chimed again. An archive file had been recovered from the system backup. This one was not a contract revision or an access log. It was a spreadsheet. A long, detailed record of consulting payments, private meeting schedules, and confidential agreements dating back 7 months. The kind of document that tells a story the people in it never intended anyone to read. Daniel opened it. Names filled the screen. Dates. Dollar amounts. Hotel addresses. Conference call records. A trail of quiet transactions that painted a picture of coordination far more organized, far more patient, and far more deliberate than anyone in the room had imagined. Then Daniel reached the final column. The last section of the spreadsheet, separated from the rest by a blank row, as if whoever compiled it had paused before typing the final entry. He stopped scrolling. His face went completely still. Malcolm, there's a name here that doesn't make sense. Malcolm stepped closer. One name appeared at the bottom of the list, isolated and alone. Elise Ali. Malcolm's daughter. The room seemed to tilt. The sound of rain disappeared. The hum of the air conditioning vanished. The lights felt sharper, the shadows darker. Malcolm stared at the screen and felt something he had not felt in 30 years of business. Not anger. Not confusion. Doubt. The kind that reaches past your thoughts and grabs something deeper. The part of you that wonders whether you missed something so fundamental, so close to home, that the missing of it calls everything else into question. That's impossible, he said. Daniel enlarged the entry. Meeting records. Travel reimbursements. Consulting summaries. Each one linked to Elisa's foundation account. His daughter was 26 years old. She ran a literacy program for children in underserved communities through the Hale Foundation. She had no involvement in corporate governance. She attended no board meetings. She had never expressed any interest in the business beyond the charitable work it funded. Daniel opened the attached signature documents. Scanned pages appeared on the screen. Each one bore Elisa's name in flowing cursive. But something was wrong. Sarah had moved closer to the screen without anyone noticing. She stood beside Daniel's chair, her small frame barely reaching the edge of the conference table. She pointed at the second signature with one small finger. That's not the same. Daniel looked down at her. What? The letters are different. Look at the way the E starts. And the loop at the bottom of the H. Daniel magnified the images. He placed the first and second signatures side by side on the screen. Then the third. Then the fourth. The room went silent. She's right, Daniel whispered. These aren't consistent. The baseline slopes change between documents. The pressure points vary. The spacing is different. Malcolm felt the knot in his chest begin to loosen. They were forged. Daniel nodded slowly. Someone replicated her signature to create a paper trail. But they didn't do it well enough to survive close comparison. Artur dropped his head into his hands. Victor. We don't know that definitively, Daniel cautioned. I do, Arthur said quietly. Because he asked me about Elise 3 months ago about her foundation accounts. About her signature authorizations. About how reimbursements were processed. He thought he was reviewing donor compliance protocols. He gave him the information without a second thought. Malcolm turned to face the windows. The storm was directly overhead now. Lightning flickered somewhere behind the clouds, briefly illuminating the glass canyons of the city below in a cold, electric blue. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass and closed his eyes. He had almost signed. One stroke of a silver pen, and his company would have been transferred to people who had spent 7 months engineering the theft from the inside. His daughter's name would have been permanently tied to the fraud. His reputation, his legacy, his life's work, all of it would have collapsed under the weight of a scandal he never saw coming. And nobody in this room, not the attorneys, not the board members, not the compliance team, not the investors watching remotely, would have caught it in time. Nobody except an 8-year-old girl in a faded sweater and borrowed sneakers, standing in a doorway she was never supposed to walk through. He opened his eyes and turned around. Sarah. She looked up at him. You said you came here because your grandmother's friend works maintenance in the building. Sarah nodded. What's your grandmother's name? Ruth Ellington. The name moved through Malcolm like a current. Not sudden recognition. Something slower. Deeper. The way a song from childhood returns, not the melody first, but the feeling that lived underneath it. A warmth he couldn't explain, connected to a memory he couldn't quite reach. Daniel was already tapping. Seconds later, a personnel archive appeared on the screen. Ruth Ellington. Volunteer Coordinator. Community Outreach Division. Ali Infrastructure Foundation. Active service between 2004 and 2015. Over a decade of community work, quietly documented in a database that nobody had searched in years. Malcolm stared at the record. I know that name. Daniel scrolled deeper. A photograph appeared. Fadid, slightly overexposed, taken during a company event more than 20 years ago. A younger Malcolm Hale stood beside a group of community volunteers in front of a half-constructed community center on Chicago's south side. The sky behind them was gray. The concrete was still wet. And beside Malcolm, holding a clipboard and wearing a yellow safety vest over a floral print dress, was a woman with deep brown skin, wire-rimmed glasses, and a calm, determined expression that seemed completely unaffected by the chaos of the construction site around her. Ruth Ellington. Sarah's breath caught. That's my grandma. Malcolm nodded slowly. Memories were surfacing now, rising through years of board meetings and quarterly reports like objects from the bottom of a lake. That was the year the company nearly went under. Daniel looked up. The South Side Reconstruction Project. We lost our largest municipal contract. 3 investors pulled out in the same week. The press was running stories about how Hale Infrastructure would be bankrupt by Christmas. Malcolm's voice grew quieter with each sentence, as though he were walking deeper into a room he hadn't entered in 20 years. The only reason we survived was because the communities we served stood behind us. They wrote letters. They attended city council meetings. They testified that our work mattered. And Ruth Ellington was one of the people who organized every single one of those efforts. I looked at Sarah. Your grandmother helped save this company before it became what it is today. When every banker and every investor had given up on us, the people in those neighborhoods did not. They showed up. They fought for us. And Ruth, your grandmother, she organized it. She knocked on doors. She made phone calls. She convinced people who had every reason to distrust a construction company to give us one more chance. Malcolm paused. The memory was heavier than he expected. We never properly thanked her. We got busy. We grew. We moved to bigger offices and taller buildings, and somehow the people who held us up when we were small became invisible. Sarah touched the bracelet on her wrist. She never told me any of that. No, Malcolm said softly. She wouldn't have. That's exactly the kind of person she is. The kind who does the right thing and never sends an invoice for it. Daniel's computer chimed again. Another recovered file surfaced from deep inside the archive, pulled from a backup system that had been storing documents no one had accessed in nearly 2 decades. The file name read Confidential Compliance Report, and the date was 18 years old. Daniel opened it. The document was a formal internal investigation report. 12 pages. Witness statements. Financial records. Subcontractor invoices. And at the center of the entire investigation, a whistleblower report filed by Ruth Ellington. Malcolm read over Daniel's shoulder. 18 years ago, during the Southside Reconstruction Project, Ruth had discovered irregularities in subcontractor payments. Money was being routed through shell accounts that existed only on paper. Invoices were inflated by 30 to 40%. Construction materials were being billed twice under different project codes. The fraud was sophisticated enough to pass casual inspection but obvious to anyone who cared enough to compare the numbers line by line. Ruth cared enough. She reported everything. Filed formal complaints. Provided documentation. Testified before internal investigators. An investigation followed. Several subcontracts were terminated. 3 employees were dismissed. The matter was resolved quietly to protect the company from what would have been a devastating public scandal during its most vulnerable period. And the subcontracting firm at the center of the misconduct was a company that was later acquired and rebranded by a young consultant named Victor Strand. Malcolm sat down heavily. The connections were forming a pattern that stretched across 2 decades like cracks in a foundation that had been hidden under fresh paint for years. Daniel opened the final attachment in the compliance file. A handwritten letter, scanned and preserved in the digital archive. The handwriting was elegant, precise, careful, the kind of penmanship that belonged to a generation that still believed words should be beautiful, even when the truth they carried was ugly. Daniel read the closing line aloud. The truth does not need an audience. It only needs one person willing to speak. Sarah. Whispered, she says that to me every night before bed. The room was silent. Not the uncomfortable silence of tension or conflict. A different kind. The kind that happens when a room full of powerful people suddenly remembers that power is not the same thing as goodness. That success is not the same thing as integrity. That a woman in a yellow safety vest, holding a clipboard on a construction site 20 years ago, had more courage than everyone at this conference table combined. Daniel continued searching the archive. One final document appeared. An interview transcript from the original investigation, 18 years old. Dusty digital pages that had been sitting in a server room somewhere, waiting for someone to find them. He opened it. Pages of questions and answers filled the screen. Ruth Ellington speaking clearly, precisely, without emotion, simply stating what she had found. Internal investigators asking follow-up questions. And Victor Strand, identified at the time as a junior associate at the subcontracting firm, providing his own testimony. Daniel scrolled to the last page. He says moved quickly across the text, and then stopped. Malcolm. What is it? Daniel looked up slowly. Victor Strand wasn't the one Ruth originally reported. The room became absolutely still. The person she identified was the founder of the subcontracting firm. Victor's mentor. The man who built the company and ran it for 20 years before Victor inherited it after the founder's retirement. Malcolm leaned forward. You're telling me that Victor Strand spent 18 years carrying someone else's guilt? Daniel nodded. The original investigation findings cleared him specifically. But the settlement agreement grouped every individual associated with the firm under the same confidentiality clause. His name stayed attached to the scandal in the archived records, even though the evidence pointed to someone else entirely. Judith, who had been silent for nearly 20 minutes, spoke softly. Her voice sounded different now. Dinner. Stripped of the armor she usually wore. He told me that 6 months ago. Malcolm looked at her. That's how it started, she said. Her eyes were fixed on the table. Victor came to me with the old records. He showed me the settlement. He showed me how his name had been linked to misconduct he didn't commit. It believed the company had deliberately buried the truth to protect its reputation. It believed he had been made a scapegoat to keep everything clean. And you helped him, Malcolm said. I believed him. Believing someone's pain does not give you the right to steal a company. Judith closed her eyes. No, she whispered. It doesn't. The room sat with that truth for a long time. The rain outside had begun to soften. The thunder moved eastward, pulling the darkest clouds with it like curtains being drawn open. Arthur removed his glasses and set them on the table. So all of this, the altered contract, the forged signatures, the hidden governance clause, the fake paper trail using Elisa's name, it started because one man felt the world owed him something for a crime he didn't commit. Daniel nodded. And it would have worked. If nobody had caught it, Malcolm would have signed, and within 90 days, control of the company would have transferred to a management group assembled by Victor Strand. Every person in the room looked at Zara. She stood in the same place she had been standing since the beginning. Near the doorway. Calm. Quiet. A smile and perfectly still. Wearing a dead woman's bracelet and carrying a truth that 14 floors of security, 6 attorneys, $300 million, and 14 months of legal review had failed to detect. Malcolm walked toward her slowly. He moved differently now. Not like a billionaire crossing a boardroom. Like a man approaching something sacred. He knelt down so that his eyes were level with hers. Do you understand what you did today? He asked. Sarah looked at him. Her brown eyes were clear. Bourdenif. I just told you what I saw. No, Malcolm said. You did what your grandmother did. You told the truth when it would have been easier, safer, and simpler to stay quiet and walk away. Sarah touched the bracelet. The faded blue thread caught the light from the windows, where the first break in the storm clouds was beginning to appear. She always says, the truth is heavy. But it's heavier when you don't put it down. Malcolm smiled. Not the confident, practiced smile of a billionaire at a press conference. Not the polished smile he wore for cameras and handshakes and investor meetings. A different smile. Smaller. Softer. Imperfect. The kind of smile that costs something to give because it comes from a place that has no armor. Then she raised you exactly right. He stood and turned toward the room. His voice was steady again. Clear. Controlled. But underneath the control was something new. Something that hadn't been there when the meeting started. The merger will be restructured from the first page. Every clause will be reviewed by an independent legal team with no prior connection to this firm. Victor Strand's involvement will be formally investigated and referred to the appropriate authorities. Arthur, you will cooperate fully with the inquiry. Judith, you will do the same. Arthur nodded immediately. Judith hesitated. Then she nodded as well. The fight had left her somewhere between the photograph and the transcript, and what remained was a woman who looked like she had been carrying a secret for so long that putting it down felt like losing a part of herself. And one more thing, Malcolm said. He looked at Daniel. I want Ruth Ellington's file restored to the active archive. Her name should have been remembered years ago. She protected this company when it had nothing, and we let her disappear into a database nobody bothered to search. That ends today. Daniel tapped quietly. The sound of his keyboard was the only noise in the room. Through the glass walls, the storm had passed. A thin band of golden light appeared along the horizon, cutting through the remaining clouds like a blade drawn slowly across gray silk. The Chicago skyline glowed beneath it, steel and glass and ambition, shining wet and clean in the aftermath of a storm that had nearly destroyed everything built upon it. 3 weeks later, the merger was finalized under entirely new terms. Transparent. Clean. Reviewed by 3 independent firms and approved unanimously by a restructured board. An independent governance committee was established to oversee compliance for the next 36 months. Victor Strand was removed from all advisory roles and faced a formal investigation that would eventually result in charges. The forged documents were entered into evidence. Judith Ashford resigned and cooperated fully with the inquiry as part of a negotiated agreement. Arthur Langley retained his position after a thorough, independent review confirmed every detail of his account. But the moment that stayed with people, the moment that employees talked about for years afterward, the moment that was eventually written about in a business journal and shared across social media until it reached millions of people who had never heard of Hale Infrastructure, happened on a quiet Tuesday morning in the lobby of Hale Tower. A bronze plaque was mounted on the marble wall beside the main entrance. Simple. Elegant. Permanent. At the top, 2 names were engraved in clean, clear letters. Ruth Ellington. Sarah Ellington. Beneath them, a single sentence. The truth does not need an audience. It only needs one person willing to speak. Every morning, as employees passed through the lobby on their way to meetings and conference calls and quarterly reviews, they saw that plaque. Some paused. Some nodded. Some touched it briefly with their fingertips, the way people touch something they want to remember. And some simply kept walking, carrying the sentence with them into boardrooms and offices and conference calls, into rooms where decisions were made and futures were shaped and legacies were written. And somewhere on the south side of Chicago, in a small apartment with thin walls and windows that rattled when the January wind blew through the cracks, an 8-year-old girl sat at a kitchen table doing her homework. A faded blue bracelet rested against her wrist. Her grandmother sat across from her, reading a newspaper and drinking coffee from a chipped ceramic mug that said "World's Best Grandma" in letters that were almost too faded to read. Sarah looked up from her math worksheet. Grandma? Do you think he would have signed it, if I hadn't said anything? Ruth Ellington set her mug down. Slowly. She folded the newspaper and placed it beside her plate. Then she looked at her granddaughter with the same calm, steady gaze that had once stopped a fraud, saved a company, and changed the trajectory of a man's entire legacy. Probably, she said. Sarah thought about that for a moment. Then I'm glad I said something. Ruth smiled. Not a wide smile. A knowing smile. The kind that only comes from having lived long enough to understand that the world is rarely changed by the loudest voice in the room. That courage does not require volume. That integrity is not a performance. And that sometimes, the most powerful thing a person can do is simply tell the truth, even when every force in the room is designed to keep that truth quiet. So am I, baby, she said softly. So am me. Outside, the Chicago sky stretched wide and clean above the skyline. The towers caught the late afternoon light, and for a moment, just a moment, the city looked like it was made entirely of gold. But gold fades. Buildings age. Contracts expire. Empires rise and fall and are forgotten by the same history books that once celebrated them. The deals that seemed world-changing become footnotes. The names that filled headlines become trivia questions. The towers that scrape the sky eventually come down, replaced by newer, taller towers that will one day come down too. What remains, what always remains, is the truth someone was brave enough to speak. Not the comfortable truth. Not the popular truth. The kind of truth that makes a room full of powerful people go silent. The kind that interrupts. The kind that costs something. And sometimes, that someone is 8 years old. Standing in a doorway she was never supposed to walk through. Wearing a bracelet she inherited from the only person who ever taught her that honesty is not something you practice when it is convenient. Not something you perform when the cameras are rolling. Not something you believe in only when it benefits you. It is something you carry. Every single day. In every room. At every table. Whether the people around you want to hear it, or not. Whether they thank you for it, or not. Whether the world notices. Or not. Because the truth was never about the audience. It was always about the person brave enough to speak it.